Martinez wiped down the same greasy table for the third time that morning, her rag barely making a dent in the accumulated grime that seemed to coat every surface of Tony's diner. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across her tired face as she watched the elderly owner, Anthony Tony Castellano, bark orders at the cook through the kitchen pass-through window. At 72, Tony moved with the rigid determination of a man who had spent 40 years building something from nothing, and his weathered hands gripped his coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. The morning rush had ended an hour ago, leaving behind empty booths, scattered napkins, and the lingering smell of bacon grease mixed with industrial-strength coffee. Hannah had been working at the diner for 3 years, arriving every morning at 5:30 to prep for the 6 o'clock opening, staying until closing at 9, and somehow managing to remain invisible to the man who signed her paychecks. Tony barely acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional grunt when she handed him the daily receipts, or the sharp look when a customer complaint reached his ears. She moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, stacking chairs, refilling salt and pepper shakers, and checking the napkin dispensers at each booth. The red vinyl seats had seen better decades, their surfaces cracked and patched with duct tape, but Hannah treated each one with the same meticulous care she brought to everything else. Her fellow waitresses came and went with regularity, most lasting only a few weeks before. Tony's gruff demeanor and the demanding pace drove them away, but Hannah remained, steady as the clock on the wall that had been telling time for longer than she had been alive. Tony's routine never varied. He arrived at 5 each morning, an hour before Hannah, to count the register and review the previous day's numbers. He spoke to suppliers with the same clipped efficiency he used with everyone else, negotiating prices with the intensity of a man who understood that every penny mattered. His office, a cramped space behind the kitchen filled with filing cabinets and yellowed invoices, served as his fortress where he retreated between the breakfast and lunch rushes, emerging only when absolutely necessary. The relationship between owner and employee existed in a space of professional distance that never wavered. Hannah received her paycheck every Friday, handed to her without ceremony or conversation, and Tony received her silent competence in return. She watched him eating alone at the corner booth every evening after closing, the same meal turkey sandwich, black coffee, slice of apple pie, while he reviewed the day's receipts under the amber glow of the booth's lamp. His solitude seemed as permanent as the fixtures, as unchangeable as the faded menu boards that hung above the counter. Other employees whispered about Tony's past, spinning stories about a wife who had died 20 years ago, children who never called, and a life that had narrowed to the 4 walls of the diner. Hannah listened but never participated in these conversations, focusing instead on her work and the small improvements she could make without drawing attention. She noticed when the coffee machine needed cleaning before Tony did, anticipated when supplies were running low, and somehow managed to be exactly where she was needed without ever being asked. The lunch crowd brought its own chaos, construction workers grabbing quick meals, office employees on short breaks, and the occasional family with screaming children who left chaos in their wake. Hannah navigated through it all with quiet efficiency, taking orders, delivering food, and cleaning up messes while maintaining the kind of professional smile that had become second nature. Tony watched from behind the counter, his sharp eyes missing nothing, but his expression remained unreadable. Regular customers began requesting Hannah's section without realizing they were doing it. Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday for her chicken salad sandwich, would wait 15 minutes for a table in Hannah's area, rather than sit elsewhere. The truck drivers who stopped during the evening shift knew she would have their coffee ready before they sat down, and the late-night customers appreciated that she never rushed them, no matter how tired she looked. Hannah's efficiency extended beyond mere service. She noticed patterns: which menu items were popular, when supplies needed reordering, How to arrange the dining room for maximum flow during rush periods. She made mental notes about everything, storing information that she never shared but used to anticipate problems before they occurred. When the ancient register began skipping numbers, she started keeping backup tallies on paper napkins. When the coffee machine started making strange noises, she looked up repair tutorials online during her break. The evening routine never changed. After the last customer left, Hannah would clean the dining room while Tony counted the register and prepared the night deposit. They worked in parallel, their movements choreographed by years of repetition, but always maintaining the invisible barrier that kept their interactions purely professional. Tony would lock up, Hannah would walk to her car, and they would repeat the same dance the next day. But something had begun to shift in the rhythm of their routine, subtle as the change in seasons. Tony's movements had become more deliberate, his breathing slightly labored during busy periods, and his afternoon retreats to the office had grown longer. Hannah noticed these changes with the same attention to details she brought to everything else, filing them away as information that might someday prove important. The diner operated like a machine that had been running for so long that its components had worn smooth, each part knowing its function without conscious thought. Hannah had become an integral gear in that machine, but she remained as invisible to Tony as the day she had first put on her uniform and picked up an order pad. Yet, beneath the surface of their professional distance, forces were beginning to stir that would challenge everything both of them believed about their carefully maintained boundaries. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning when Tony's hands shook as he poured his coffee. Hannah noticed the tremor immediately. She had been watching his routine for 3 years, memorizing every gesture, every pause, every habit that made up his day. The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. A sound that shouldn't have been significant, but felt like thunder in the morning quiet of the diner. She continued wiping down the counter, her movements steady and purposeful, but her peripheral vision remained locked on Tony as he retreated to his office earlier than usual. Through the small window that separated his domain from the kitchen, she could see him sitting heavily in his chair, his head resting in his hands. The image lasted only a moment before he straightened, putting on the mask of competence that he wore like armor, but Hannah had seen beneath it. The morning rush proceeded normally, at least on the surface. Orders were taken, food was served, customers came and went with their usual mixture of politeness and indifference. But Hannah found herself tracking Tony's movements with new intensity, noting the way he paused before lifting heavy items, the slight delay in his responses when the phone rang, the manner in which he gripped the edge of the counter when he thought no one was looking. Mrs. Patterson arrived at her usual time, sliding into her preferred booth with the same greeting she had used for months. "Good morning, dear. The usual, please." Hannah smiled and nodded, already reaching for the coffee pot. But her mind remained focused on the office behind the kitchen, where Tony was moving papers around his desk with uncharacteristic restlessness. She had learned to read the diner like a book, interpreting every sound, every movement, every change in the normal flow of activity. The lunch rush brought its familiar chaos, but Hannah noticed how Tony stayed behind the counter more than usual, letting the cook handle most of the kitchen coordination. She picked up the slack without conscious thought, anticipating needs before they were voiced, smoothing over small problems before they could escalate into larger ones. A new customer complained about his burger being overcooked, and Hannah had a replacement ready before Tony even heard about the issue. During the afternoon lull, she found herself inventing reasons to pass by Tony's office, ostensibly checking supply levels or straightening the storage area, but really monitoring his condition. He sat staring at paperwork without reading it, his coffee growing cold beside him, his breathing shallow and deliberate. When he caught her looking, his expression hardened into its familiar mask of professional distance, but not before she saw something that looked almost like vulnerability. The evening shift brought a new tension to their routine. Tony emerged from his office more frequently, checking on things that hadn't needed checking before, questioning decisions that had been routine for years. When Hannah suggested they were running low on coffee filters, he asked her to show him the supply cabinet as if he hadn't been ordering those same filters for decades. She complied without comment, but the exchange felt charged with unspoken meaning. A new waitress named Jennifer had started the previous week, and Hannah found herself training her with extra patience, knowing that Tony's tolerance for mistakes had grown even thinner. Jennifer was eager, but clumsy, dropping plates and forgetting orders with the kind of regularity that would normally have resulted in immediate termination. Hannah quietly fixed the girls' errors, smoothing over problems before they reached Tony's attention, and gradually Jennifer's performance improved. The dinner crowd included several regulars who had specific preferences that weren't written down anywhere. Mr. Rodriguez wanted his eggs scrambled with cheese but no peppers. Mrs. Chun preferred her tea water heated to exactly the right temperature, and the young couple in booth 7 always shared a piece of chocolate cake but needed 2 forks. Hannah had memorized these details over months of service, but she began to wonder what would happen to this accumulated knowledge if something happened to her, or, more importantly, to Tony. Late in the evening, as Hannah cleaned the last booth, she heard Tony on the phone in his office, his voice lower than usual but carrying through the thin walls. "I need to see you again," he was saying to someone, and the tone suggested this was not a business call. The tests. "I need to understand what comes next." The conversation was brief, but it confirmed what Hannah's trained observation had already suggested. Something was seriously wrong. The closing routine proceeded with its usual precision, but the atmosphere felt different, charged with unspoken knowledge and growing concern. Tony counted the register with more concentration than usual, checking figures multiple times before sliding the money into the deposit bag. Hannah finished her cleaning and prepared to leave, but she lingered by the door, unsure why she was hesitating. "Everything all right, Mr. Castellano?" she asked, using his formal name as she always did, though the question felt heavier than the words suggested. Tony looked up from the register, and for a moment, his guard dropped completely. She saw exhaustion, worry, and something that might have been fear before the familiar walls went back up. "Everything's fine," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "See you tomorrow." The words were a dismissal, but they felt more like a plea, as if he was asking her to promise that tomorrow would indeed come, that the routine they had built together would continue unchanged. Hannah drove home through empty streets, her mind churning with questions she couldn't answer. The diner had become the center of her world over the past 3 years, providing not just employment but structure, purpose, and a kind of belonging she hadn't found elsewhere. The thought of that stability being threatened stirred feelings she hadn't expected to have about a job that most people would consider temporary at best. She lay awake that night thinking about trembling hands, unfinished phone conversations, and the way Tony had looked at her when she asked if everything was all right. Something fundamental was shifting in the carefully maintained order of their shared world, and Hannah found herself wondering if she was prepared for whatever came next. The next morning arrived with the kind of spring rain that turned the city's streets into mirror surfaces, reflecting neon signs and streetlights in wavering patterns that made everything look unstable. Hannah arrived at the diner 10 minutes early, as she always did, but found Tony already there, sitting in the same corner booth where he ate his evening meals, staring out at the empty parking lot with an expression that suggested he had been there for hours. She unlocked the front door and began her opening routine, but kept glancing toward Tony's motionless figure. His coffee cup sat empty beside him, and the newspaper lay folded and unread on the table. When she approached with the coffee pot, he didn't acknowledge her presence until she was standing directly beside the booth. You're early," she said softly, pouring fresh coffee into his cup without being asked. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent the night wrestling with thoughts that offered no rest. "Doctor's appointment this afternoon?" The admission came out reluctantly, as if he hadn't meant to share that information, but found himself unable to stop the words. Hannah nodded and moved away, understanding that he had revealed more than he intended and needed space to process that vulnerability. The morning prep work took on a different quality, as Hannah found herself paying attention to details that had never seemed important before. She memorized the way Tony liked his coffee prepared, noted which sections of the newspaper he read first, observed how he arranged his workspace behind the counter. These small rituals that had been background noise for 3 years suddenly felt precious, as if she was collecting memories against an uncertain future. When Jennifer arrived for her shift, Hannah found herself explaining not just the visible procedures, but the unwritten rules that governed the diner's operation. "Mr. Castellano doesn't like the radio too loud during breakfast," she explained as they set up the dining room, "and never refill his coffee without asking first." Jennifer nodded eagerly, but Hannah could see that the girl didn't understand the deeper significance of these seemingly arbitrary preferences. The breakfast rush proceeded normally, but Hannah noticed Tony watching her with new intensity. When she handled a complaint about slow service, he observed her interaction with the customer. When she coordinated with the cook to expedite orders during the busy period, she felt his eyes tracking her movements. It was as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and the attention made her self-conscious in ways that 3 years of invisibility never had. A regular customer named Frank, who owned a construction company and brought his crew in twice a week, made his usual joke about Hannah running the place better than most managers he knew. "You've got a good one here, Tony," he said, nodding toward Hannah as she refilled his coffee. "Don't know how you keep her from getting snatched up by some fancy restaurant downtown." Tony's response was a non-committal grunt, but Hannah caught him studying her with an expression she couldn't read. During the lunch lull, Tony asked Hannah to help him in the office, ostensibly to review the week's inventory orders. As they sat across from his cluttered desk, she noticed how his handwriting had become less steady. How he had to concentrate harder on calculations that had once been automatic. When he asked her opinion about switching suppliers for produce, she was surprised by the question he had never sought her input on business decisions before. "You notice things?" he said after she had offered detailed observations about which vegetables were consistently fresh and which arrived already past their prime. "How long have you been paying attention to stuff like that?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was ready to address directly. "I just noticed things," Hannah replied, unconsciously echoing his words. It's part of doing the job right, but they both knew it was more than that. She had been studying the diner's operation with the intensity of someone who cared about its success. Someone who had invested herself in its continuation beyond what any paycheck could justify. The afternoon brought an unusual event. Tony closed the office early and left for his doctor's appointment without his usual detailed instructions for handling emergencies. As the door closed behind him, Hannah realized she had never seen him leave during business hours in all her time working there. Jennifer looked nervous about being left with only Hannah for supervision. But the afternoon shift proceeded smoothly, almost more smoothly than usual. A supplier called about a late delivery, and Hannah handled the conversation with confidence that surprised her. A customer wanted to pay for a large catering order, and she processed the transaction while making mental notes about which items were most popular for takeout orders. When the coffee machine started making the familiar grinding noise that preceded a breakdown, she performed the informal maintenance routine she had developed through months of observation. By the time Tony returned, 3 hours later, Hannah had managed 2 minor crises, coordinated with 3 suppliers, and helped a confused elderly customer figure out the correct change for his bill. Tony surveyed the dining room, checked the register, and reviewed the orders that had been placed in his absence. His expression revealed nothing. But Hannah sensed that he was taking inventory of more than just the day's business. "Everything went okay," she reported, handing him a list of the calls that had come in and the decisions she had made. Tony read through her notes with careful attention, occasionally asking for clarification about her reasoning. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression that seemed to be reevaluating everything he thought he knew about her capabilities. "You did good," he said finally. And the simple praise felt weighted with meaning that neither of them was prepared to explore. "Tomorrow we need to talk about some changes around here." The statement was casual, but it carried the kind of significance that changes everything. The moment when invisible becomes visible, when routine becomes preparation for something entirely different. Hannah spent the rest of her shift wondering what changes might mean, and found herself hoping that whatever was happening in Tony's life, whatever news the doctor had delivered, wouldn't result in the kind of upheaval that would destroy the fragile stability she had built her life around. But beneath the worry was something else. A growing sense that she might be capable of handling more responsibility than she had ever imagined, and that Tony was beginning to see possibilities that had been hidden in plain sight for 3 years. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the diner's ancient air conditioning system wheeze like an old man climbing stairs. Hannah arrived to find Tony already at his usual morning post behind the counter. But something was different in his posture, a slump to his shoulders that spoke of defeat, resignation, or perhaps acceptance of something he could no longer fight. The conversation about changes that Tony had promised never materialized. Instead, he threw himself into the morning routine with an intensity that felt almost manic, checking and rechecking things that had been running smoothly for years. He questioned Hannah about coffee temperatures, demanded to see the previous day's receipts twice, and snapped at Jennifer for an imaginary mistake that left the younger waitress close to tears. Hannah found herself running interference between Tony's increasing irritability and the normal demands of the business. When a longtime customer complained about his eggs being too runny, she quietly had the cook prepare a replacement before Tony could escalate the situation into an argument. When the bread delivery arrived 30 minutes late, she signed for it and stored everything properly, while Tony paced behind the counter, muttering about unreliable suppliers and declining standards. The morning rush felt like navigating a minefield. Tony's usual gruff efficiency had been replaced by erratic behavior that made everyone customers, suppliers, and staff walk on eggshells. A simple question about the daily specials triggered a 10-minute lecture about how people didn't appreciate quality anymore. When Jennifer asked for help with a complicated order, Tony's response was so harsh that Hannah stepped in to provide guidance while he retreated to his office. Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, Tony's niece from Philadelphia, arrived unannounced just before the lunch rush. Hannah recognized her from the family photos on Tony's desk, though the woman looked older and more tired than in the pictures. She was in her 40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. The reunion between uncle and niece took place in Tony's office with the door closed, but their voices carried through the thin walls. Hannah heard fragments of conversation that painted a picture she had been dreading. Advanced stages, 6 months. Maybe less. Need to make arrangements. The clinical language of medical realities crashed against the familiar sounds of the diner like waves against a seawall. Elizabeth emerged from the office an hour later with red-rimmed eyes and the purposeful stride of someone who had just accepted an enormous responsibility. She surveyed the dining room with the appraising gaze of someone calculating assets and liabilities. mentally cataloging everything from the cash register to the condition of the booth cushions. When her eyes met Hannah's, there was a moment of mutual assessment that felt significant. "You must be Hannah," Elizabeth said, approaching the counter where Hannah was preparing for the lunch rush. "Uncle Tony says you've been here for 3 years." The statement was neutral. But Hannah sensed she was being evaluated for purposes she didn't understand. "He also says, you know this place better than anyone except him." The lunch crowd arrived with its usual chaos, but Hannah noticed how Elizabeth positioned herself to observe the flow of operations. She watched Hannah coordinate with the kitchen, handle multiple tables simultaneously, and manage the minor crises that arose during any busy period. When Jennifer struggled with a large order, Elizabeth observed how Hannah smoothly provided assistance without disrupting her own responsibilities. Tony emerged from his office looking haggard and older than his 72 years. The conversation with his niece had clearly taken a toll, stripping away the last pretenses of normalcy that he had been maintaining. He moved through the afternoon routine mechanically, but Hannah could see that his attention was elsewhere, focused on futures that he was only beginning to contemplate. During the afternoon lull, Elizabeth approached Hannah with the directness of someone who had spent years making difficult decisions. "I need to understand how this place really operates," she said. "Tony's. He's not going to be able to manage everything much longer. I live in Philadelphia. I have my own career, and I don't know anything about running a restaurant." The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Hannah was afraid to fully consider. Elizabeth continued. "Tony says, the suppliers, the regular customers, the daily routines. He says you anticipate problems before they happen and fix things before he even knows they're broken." "I just do my job," Hannah replied, but the words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. They both knew it was more than that. Over 3 years, she had absorbed the rhythm and requirements of the diner until she could operate it almost as well as Tony himself. But acknowledging that capability felt like admitting to aspirations she had never allowed herself to have. Elizabeth spent the rest of the afternoon asking questions that revealed the depth of Hannah's involvement in the diner's daily operation. Who were the reliable suppliers? Which customers had special requirements? How did the scheduling work? What were the profit margins on different menu items? Hannah found herself answering with detailed knowledge that surprised even her. The evening shift brought an uncomfortable tension as Tony, Elizabeth, and Hannah navigated around the unspoken realities that dominated their thoughts. Tony's terminal diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, as Hannah eventually learned from overheard conversations, had transformed the diner from a stable business into something that needed to be managed, transferred, or sold. The routine that had seemed permanent suddenly felt fragile, temporary, subject to forces beyond anyone's control. As closing time approached, Elizabeth pulled Hannah aside for a conversation that felt like an audition she hadn't known she was taking. "Tony wants to keep this place running," Elizabeth explained. "He's built something here and he doesn't want it to die with him. But he needs someone who can take over the day-to-day management. Someone who understands the business from the ground up." The offer that wasn't quite an offer hung between them, pregnant with possibilities that Hannah had never dared to imagine. Manager, partner, perhaps eventually something more. The invisible waitress who had spent 3 years perfecting her understanding of every aspect of the diner's operation was being invited to step into a role that could transform her entire life. But the opportunity came wrapped in the inevitable loss of the man who had created the world she had come to love. And the weight of that realization made her throat tighten with emotions she hadn't expected to feel about an employer who had barely acknowledged her existence for 3 years. Friday morning dawned clear and cool, bringing with it a sense of finality that none of them could ignore. Tony arrived looking like a man who had spent the night making peace with decisions he couldn't reverse. His movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if he was checking items off an invisible list that only he could see. Elizabeth sat at the counter nursing her second cup of coffee, papers spread before her like battle plans for a war she hadn't wanted to fight. Hannah went through her opening routine with mechanical precision, but her mind was churning with the implications of the previous day's conversations. The possibility of managing the diner, of stepping out of invisibility into leadership, felt both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent 3 years learning every aspect of the business, but always as an observer, never as someone responsible for making the decisions that determined success or failure. The morning briefing took place in Tony's office, cramped but suddenly feeling formal, official, like the signing of important documents. Tony sat behind his desk with Elizabeth beside him, while Hannah perched on the edge of a chair that had been brought in from the dining room. The arrangement put her in the position of being interviewed, evaluated, considered for a role she had never imagined pursuing. "I'm going to be direct," Tony began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had exhausted his capacity for subtlety. "The cancer is advanced. I've got months, not years. This place is my life's work, and I need to know it's going to survive me." He paused, studying Hannah's face for reactions she wasn't sure she was giving. "Elizabeth has her own life in Philadelphia. She can't move here. Can't learn this business from scratch." Elizabeth took over the conversation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex transitions. "What we're proposing is a gradual transfer of responsibility. You would start as assistant manager, learning the business side while maintaining your current duties. Eventually, if everything works out, you could become the full manager or even buy into the business as a partner." The words hit Hannah like a physical force. Partnership, ownership, the transformation from invisible employee to visible leader. But beneath the excitement was a growing awareness of what such a change would cost. Not just the financial obligations she couldn't yet calculate, but the emotional weight of watching Tony's health decline while simultaneously learning to replace him. "I need to know you understand what you'd be taking on," Tony continued. "This isn't just serving food and counting money. You're responsible for people's jobs, for keeping standards high, for making decisions when things go wrong. Some days you'll work 14 hours and barely break even. Some days you'll want to quit and do anything else." Hannah looked around the office that had been Tony's sanctuary for 4 decades, noting the yellowed photographs of customers and staff from years past, the filing cabinets stuffed with invoices and receipts, the coffee-stained calculator that had been computing profits and losses since before she was born. The weight of continuity pressed down on her, the responsibility for maintaining something that had become central to so many people's lives. "Can I have the weekend to think about it?" she asked, and both Tony and Elizabeth nodded with the understanding of people who recognized the magnitude of what they were asking. But even as she requested time to consider, Hannah knew her answer was already forming. The diner had become her world, and the opportunity to shape its future felt like a calling she hadn't known she was waiting for. The rest of Friday passed in a strange atmosphere of transition and possibility. Hannah found herself seeing everything differently, not just as an employee following established routines, but as someone who might soon be responsible for creating and maintaining those routines. When a customer complained about the quality of his burger, she didn't just apologize and arrange for a replacement. She considered what systemic changes might prevent similar problems in the future. Elizabeth spent the day shadowing Hannah, taking notes on everything from supplier relationships to customer preferences. "You know Mrs. Patterson's order by heart," she observed as Hannah automatically prepared the chicken salad sandwich with extra pickles and light mayo. "How many regular customers are there like that?" "Maybe 40 or 50 who come in at least once a week," Hannah replied, then surprised herself by continuing, "But it's more than just memorizing orders. You learn to read people, to know when someone's having a bad day and needs extra attention, when someone just wants to be left alone with their coffee." The afternoon brought a stream of regular customers who seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Frank, the construction worker, lingered longer than usual, chatting with Tony about old times and shared experiences that stretched back decades. Mrs. Patterson asked after Tony's health with the concern of someone who had been part of his extended family for years. The daily rituals felt weighted with meaning, as if everyone was unconsciously participating in a kind of farewell ceremony. During the evening lull, Tony called Hannah into his office for a private conversation that felt like a final examination. "Tell me what you think this place needs," he said, not as someone who takes orders, but as someone who might be giving them. Hannah took a deep breath and shared observations she had been accumulating for 3 years. The dining room could use better lighting. The menu needed updating to include healthier options. The morning rush could be managed more efficiently with better coordination between the kitchen and the serving staff. The delivery system for supplies could be streamlined to reduce costs and improve freshness. Tony listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a pad that Hannah realized was filled with similar observations. His own list of improvements and concerns that he had been compiling as his legacy. When she finished, he looked at her with an expression that mixed pride, sadness, and something that might have been relief. "You've been watching," he said. "Really watching, not just going through the motions. That's what it takes." He paused, seeming to wrestle with emotions that had been building for days. "I never had children. This place, these people who come here every day, this routine we've built, it's my family. I need to know it's going to be in good hands." The weight of his trust settled on Hannah's shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was ready to wear. But as she looked around the office, that might someday be hers. At the photographs of customers who had become friends, at the accumulated evidence of a life spent building something meaningful, she felt a sense of purpose that she had never experienced before. The evening closed with an unspoken understanding that decisions had been made. That the conversation over the weekend would be a formality, confirming what all 3 of them already knew. Hannah would accept the challenge of learning to run the diner, and Tony would have the peace of knowing that his life's work would continue beyond his own time. Saturday arrived without the usual sense of weekend relief, carrying instead the weight of a decision that Hannah had spent the entire night wrestling with. She woke before dawn, her mind already racing through scenarios and possibilities, fears and hopes tangled together in ways that made sleep impossible. The diner would be closed today, giving her the space to think clearly. But clarity felt elusive when every option carried such enormous consequences. Elizabeth had returned to Philadelphia the previous evening with a promise to come back the following weekend for Hannah's final answer. But as Hannah dressed and prepared for what felt like the most important day of her adult life, she already knew what that answer would be. The question wasn't whether she wanted the opportunity. It was whether she had the courage to embrace the transformation it would require. She drove to the diner even though it was closed, needing to sit in the space that had become her second home. To imagine herself in Tawny's role, to test whether the dream felt real or impossible. The parking lot was empty except for Tony's ancient Buick, and she found him inside, sitting at his usual corner booth, staring out at the city as it slowly came to life. "Couldn't stay away either," he said when she entered, not seeming surprised by her appearance. 40 years I've been opening this place, and I still come here when I need to think." He gestured to the booth across from him, inviting her to join him in a conversation that felt like a transition ceremony, a passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both contemplating the enormity of what they were considering. The diner felt different in the quiet, more intimate, more personal, like a home rather than a business. Hannah could imagine herself here in the early morning hours, preparing for another day, carrying the responsibility for everything that happened within these walls. "You know what the hardest part is?" Tony asked, breaking the silence. "It's not the long hours or the difficult customers or the razor-thin margins. It's caring about something so much that losing it would break your heart, and then having to make decisions every day that could put it at risk." Hannah nodded, understanding that he was describing not just the mechanics of ownership, but the emotional investment that made it meaningful. "You built something important here," she said. "People depend on this place, not just for food, but for belonging. Mrs. Patterson, Frank, all the regulars, this is part of their lives. That's why I need to know you understand what you're taking on," Tony continued. "This isn't just a business opportunity. You're becoming responsible for people's livelihoods, for maintaining something that's become part of the community. Some days, that responsibility will feel overwhelming." They talked for 2 hours, covering everything from supplier relationships to employee management. From seasonal fluctuations in business to the long-term financial planning necessary for sustainability, Tony shared insights that could only come from decades of experience, while Hannah asked questions that revealed the depth of her observation and the seriousness of her commitment. When the conversation turned to the emotional aspects of leadership, Tony's voice grew softer, more personal. "There will be days where you have to fire someone you like because the business can't afford to keep them. Days when you have to choose between paying yourself and keeping the place running. Days when you'll wonder if the stress is worth it. But there will also be days," he continued, "when you see Jennifer master a skill you taught her. When a customer tells you that coming here brightened their week, when you realize you've created something that makes people's lives a little better. Those days make everything else worthwhile." Hannah felt the truth of his words settling into her understanding, adding weight to the decision she had already made. The opportunity wasn't just about personal advancement or financial improvement. It was about stewardship, about maintaining something valuable for the people who depended on it. As afternoon faded into evening, Tony led Hannah through areas of the operation she had never seen before. They reviewed financial records that revealed both the challenges and the potential of the business. They discussed plans for equipment upgrades, menu changes, and facility improvements that could increase profitability without destroying the character that made the place special. "The margins are tight," Tony admitted, showing her spreadsheets that documented the reality of running a small restaurant. "But it's sustainable if you're smart about it, if you don't take unnecessary risks. If you remember that every decision affects real people's lives." The tutorial extended into the evening as Tony shared practical knowledge about everything from negotiating with suppliers to handling health inspections, from managing cash flow to dealing with difficult employees. Hannah absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who understood that this might be her only chance to learn from someone who had mastered the art of making it all work. As they prepared to leave, Tony handed Hannah a set of keys not just to the building but to the safe, the office, the storage areas. "Take these," he said. "Spend some time here alone. Imagine yourself running things. See if it feels right. Monday morning when you give me your answer, I want you to be absolutely certain." Hannah accepted the keys with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was being trusted with more than access to a building. She was being trusted with the continuation of someone's life work, with the livelihood of the people who worked there, with the preservation of something that had become essential to dozens of regular customers who considered the diner their second home. That evening, as she sat alone in the empty diner, Hannah felt the weight of possibility and responsibility settling around her like a new skin. The transformation from invisible employee to visible leader no longer felt impossible, it felt inevitable. Necessary, right? She had found her calling in a place she had never expected to find it. and she was ready to embrace the challenge of making it her own. The conversation on Monday morning lasted only 5 minutes, but it changed everything. Hannah arrived at the diner to find Tony already there. Not behind the counter as usual, but sitting at the same corner booth where they had talked on Saturday. Elizabeth had driven down from Philadelphia over the weekend, and she sat across from her uncle with papers spread between them, legal documents that would formalize the transition they had all been discussing. "I'll do it," Hannah said simply, and those 3 words launched a transformation that had been building for months. Tony's face showed relief mixed with sadness. The complex emotions of someone who is simultaneously losing and preserving the most important thing in his life. Elizabeth smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had helped solve a complicated problem. The paperwork was extensive, but straightforward. Hannah would begin immediately as assistant manager, learning the business operations while maintaining her current responsibilities. After 6 months, if both parties agreed, she would become general manager with an option to purchase a partial ownership stake. The financial arrangements were generous. Tony was more interested in ensuring continuity than maximizing profit from the transition. Training began that same afternoon. Tony walked Hannah through the business operations with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his time for teaching was limited. They reviewed supplier contracts, employee schedules, inventory management systems, and the dozens of small details that kept the diner running smoothly. Hannah took notes with the intensity of someone whose future depended on mastering every aspect of what she was learning. The transition wasn't seamless. Hannah struggled with the shift from taking orders to giving them, from being responsible only for her own work to being accountable for the entire operation. When Jennifer made a costly mistake with a catering order, Hannah had to learn how to provide correction without destroying morale. When a supplier delivered inferior produce, she had to negotiate a replacement while maintaining the relationship for future orders. But gradually, over the following weeks, Hannah grew into her new role. She discovered that her years of observation had prepared her better than she had realized. She knew which customers were likely to complain, which suppliers were reliable, which employees needed encouragement, and which needed firmer management. The invisible knowledge she had accumulated began to serve her as a foundation for visible leadership. Tony's health declined steadily but gracefully. He continued coming to the diner every day, but his role shifted from operator to consultant, from decision-maker to advisor. He watched Hannah handle increasingly complex situations with growing confidence, offering guidance when asked, but allowing her to develop her own management style. The student was becoming the teacher. The invisible was becoming indispensable. 3 months into the transition, Mrs. Patterson approached Hannah with a question that revealed how completely the transformation had taken hold. "Dear," she said, "I wanted to talk to the manager about organizing a birthday party for Tony. It seems like the kind of thing this place should do for someone who's meant so much to all of us." Hannah realized that Mrs. Patterson was talking to the manager, that she had become the person customers approached when they wanted something special to happen. The invisible waitress had evolved into someone with the authority to make decisions, to create events, to shape the experience that the diner provided to its community of regulars. The birthday party took place on a Tuesday evening in November, 6 months after Hannah had accepted the challenge of learning to run the business. The dining room was filled with customers who had become friends, employees past and present, suppliers who had worked with Tony for decades. It was a celebration of a life well lived and a business well run. But it was also an acknowledgement that change was inevitable and that continuity required new leadership. Tony's speech that evening was brief but profound. "This place has been my family for 40 years, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the dining room. "But a family isn't just about the past, it's about the future." Hannah understands what this place means to all of us, and she's going to make sure it continues to be the kind of place where people feel welcome, where they feel like they belong. The formal transfer of ownership took place the following week in a lawyer's office downtown, but the real transition had been happening gradually for months. Hannah signed papers that made her the majority owner of something she had served faithfully for 3 years. Something that had become central to her identity and her understanding of what work could mean when it was connected to community and purpose. Tony's death came quietly on a Sunday morning in January, peacefully in his sleep. 6 months after the diagnosis, and 8 months after Hannah had stepped into the role of manager. The funeral filled the largest church in the neighborhood with people whose lives had been touched by the man who had created a place where everyone was welcome, where the coffee was always fresh, and where someone always remembered how you liked your eggs. Hannah spoke at the service, not as an employee mourning her boss, but as someone who had inherited both a business and a responsibility. Tony taught me that running a restaurant isn't about food, she said. It's about creating a place where people feel valued, where they can count on consistency and care. He showed me that work becomes meaningful when it serves something larger than yourself. The diner reopened the day after the funeral with a simple sign in the window, under new management. Same family feeling. Hannah had learned that successful transitions honor the past while embracing the future. That true leadership means preserving what matters while adapting to what changes. The invisible waitress had become the visible heart of something that would continue to serve its community for years to come. 6 months later, as Hannah prepared for another busy morning, she paused to look around the dining room that had become truly hers. Jennifer, now the head waitress, was training a new employee with the same patience Hannah had once shown her. Mrs. Patterson sat in her usual booth, reading her newspaper and waiting for her usual order. Frank, the construction worker, was arguing good-naturedly with the cook about the best way to prepare hash browns. The routine continued, but it was her routine now, built on foundations that Tony had laid but adapted to serve the needs of a new generation. Hannah had learned that invisibility could become indispensability, that observation could become leadership, and that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we seek them, but when we're ready to embrace the responsibility that comes with being truly seen. The morning rush was about to begin, and Hannah Martinez, owner and manager of Tony's Diner, was ready to serve her community with the same dedication that had once made her invisible and would now make her indispensable.